The sun has not yet risen over the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the hour before dawn, the valleys fill with mist so thick that the ridgelines seem to float, disconnected from the earth below. The forest breathes in silence. No wind stirs the hemlock branches. No birds have begun their songs. The world exists in a state between night and morning, between visibility and mystery, between the known surface and something deeper that waits beneath. If you were standing on one of these ancient ridges right now, your boots wet with dew, you would see the fog pooling in the hollows like slow water. You would feel the cool air rising from somewhere unseen. You would notice, perhaps, that the mist does not settle evenly across the landscape. In some places, it swirls and drains downward, pulled by invisible currents into the ground itself, vanishing into fissures and depressions that have no names on any map. These are the Blue Ridge Mountains, worn down by 500 million years of rain and time. Beneath the oaks and laurel thickets, beneath the soil and moss, lies a hidden architecture of stone, a labyrinth carved by water moving through darkness. Some of these passages have been explored. Many have not. A few may never be found. This is a story about what lies beneath. It is a story about limestone and silence, about underground rivers and forgotten journeys, about the people who sought shelter in the earth and the scientists who still search for answers in the dark. It is a story that moves slowly, like water through rock, and it asks a question that has no simple answer. What still lies beneath these mountains that few people have ever seen? Before we descend, before we follow the water into stone, I want to invite you to join this journey more intentionally. If you enjoy thoughtful exploration of history, geology, and the quiet places where the two meet, please consider subscribing to History Sleepy Time. A like or share helps others discover these stories, and your support allows us to continue exploring the forgotten corners of the past. Thank you for being here. Now let us begin where all descents begin, at the surface, where the maps grow quiet and the known world starts to dissolve. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretch from Georgia to Pennsylvania, an ancient spine of stone covered in green. For centuries, mapmakers have drawn their outlines, traced their rivers, labeled their peaks. But maps are only as complete as the knowledge behind them. In the 18th century, colonial surveyors moved carefully through these mountains, marking property lines and territorial boundaries, but their work was limited by the landscape itself. Dense forest, steep terrain, fog that could swallow a survey team for days, and beneath it all, a geology that refused to behave predictably. Karst terrain. That is the word geologists use to describe landscapes where the bedrock is soluble, where stone can be dissolved by slightly acidic water over time. Limestone, dolomite, marble, the Blue Ridge contains all three. Where these rocks meet groundwater, caves form, sinkholes open. Springs emerge from cliffsides with no visible source. Rivers vanish underground and reappear miles away, as if the earth itself were breathing them in and out. The early surveyors could map what they could see, ridges and valleys, but the hidden drainage, the cavities and channels beneath the surface, these remained beyond their tools and understanding. Some areas were simply marked as rough country, impassable, or unworthy of detailed attention. Some landowners knew of caves on their property, but kept them unrecorded, useful for storage or livestock shelter, private knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Even today, with satellite imagery and digital elevation models, with LiDAR that can peer through forest canopy to map the ground below, there are still places in the Blue Ridge where the underground remains a mystery. Passages too narrow for humans, sumps filled with cold water. Chambers accessible only through vertical drops that require technical skill and courage. And in some cases, entrances that have not yet been found, hidden by centuries of leaf litter and stone fall, waiting in silence. Standing in the pre-dawn mist, you might notice a depression in the ground, a place where the trees grow shorter, where the soil seems to have settled. You might see a dark gap between two boulders, exhaling cool air that smells of wet stone. You might hear water moving somewhere below your feet, a sound with no visible source. These are the clues, these are the edges of the map, where certainty ends and curiosity begins. The question is not whether hidden chambers exist beneath these mountains. The question is how many, how deep, and what stories they still hold. To understand what lies beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains, we must first understand how the mountains themselves were made, and that story begins almost incomprehensibly long ago, in a world that would be unrecognizable to us now. 480 million years ago, the land that would become North America was part of a smaller continent called Laurentia. There were no trees yet, no birds, no mammals. The continents drifted slowly across the surface of the Earth, carried by the movement of tectonic plates, and over millions of years, Laurentia moved toward another landmass, a collision course set by forces deep within the planet. When continents collide, the crust buckles and folds. Rock that was once flat is pushed upward, crumpled like fabric lifted thousands of feet into the air. This is how mountains are born. The Appalachian Mountains, of which the Blue Ridge is the eastern front, were formed through a series of these collisions over hundreds of millions of years. Geologists call this the Alleghenian orogeny, the mountain-building event that occurred when the supercontinent Pangaea assembled, squeezing and thrusting and elevating ancient seafloor into towering peaks. Imagine it. Rock that had formed at the bottom of warm, shallow seas, limestone made from the compressed shells of countless tiny organisms, now lifted miles above sea level. Sandstone, shale, granite, all folded together, fractured, heated, transformed. The mountains that resulted were taller than the Rockies, perhaps as high as the Himalayas are today. But mountains, once built, begin immediately to erode. Rain falls, water seeps into cracks, ice forms and expands, wedging stone apart. Rivers carve valleys, wind strips away the peaks grain by grain. Over 200 million years, the Appalachians have been worn down, reduced to the softer, older mountains we see now. What remains is the root of something much larger, the deep foundation exposed by the patient work of weather and time. And within that foundation, water has been carving a second landscape, invisible from the surface. Limestone is made primarily of calcium carbonate, a mineral that reacts with weak acids. Rainwater, as it falls through the atmosphere and percolates through soil, absorbs carbon dioxide and becomes slightly acidic, just enough to slowly dissolve limestone. This is a gentle process, measured not in days or years, but in millennia. Water follows fractures in the rock, widens them, carves channels. Over tens of thousands of years, a crack becomes a passage becomes a tunnel becomes a cave. This is karst development, the sculpting of stone by chemistry and time. The Blue Ridge Mountains contain layers of limestone and dolomite interbedded with harder, less soluble rock. Where these soluble layers are thick and near the surface, cave systems develop. Where groundwater flows consistently along the same path, underground rivers form. Where the roof of a chamber becomes too thin to support its own weight, it collapses, creating a sinkhole that opens suddenly to the sky. The result is a landscape with two faces. Above ground, forested ridges and quiet valleys. Below ground, a maze of passages, some filled with flowing water, some dry and silent, decorated with formations that grow one drip at a time. Geological time is difficult for the human mind to grasp. We live for decades. Civilizations last for centuries. But the caves beneath the Blue Ridge have been forming for millions of years, and they are still forming now, imperceptibly, as water continues its slow work. The stalactite hanging from a cave ceiling grows, perhaps a cubic centimeter every century. The flowstone cascading down a wall began forming long before humans arrived in North America. The bones of extinct animals, found deep in some cave systems, are relics of ice ages when the climate was different, when species that no longer exist sought shelter in the dark. Understanding this timescale changes how we think about exploration. When a caver discovers a new passage, they are not finding something newly created. They are finding something that has existed in darkness for longer than our species has had language, something that has waited in silence through the rise and fall of empires, through continental drift and climate shifts, patient and indifferent. The Blue Ridge, then, is not a static monument. It is a process, ongoing, a conversation between stone and water that has been unfolding since the mountains first rose. The surface is only the beginning. Water does not disappear. It only changes location, moving through the world in a continuous cycle, falling as rain, flowing across the surface, soaking into the ground, emerging again as springs and seeps. But in karst terrain, this movement becomes complex, three-dimensional, hidden. If you stand beside a small stream in the Blue Ridge and follow it downhill, you might find that it suddenly ends. Not at a larger river, not at a pond, but simply ends, the water vanishing into a crack in the streambed, swallowed by the earth. This is a sinking stream, and it marks the entrance to an underground drainage system that may extend for miles. Below ground, the water continues its journey. It follows the path of least resistance, moving through fractures and enlarged joints in the bedrock, cutting channels, widening passages. In some places, the water flows gently, like a surface stream, murmuring over gravel beds in passages tall enough to walk through. In other places, it drops suddenly, creating underground waterfalls that roar in the darkness, mist rising in caverns no human eye has seen. And in still other places, the passage is completely filled with water, a submerged tunnel called a sump, impossible to explore without diving equipment and training. These underground rivers are not separate from the surface water system. They are part of it, the hidden portion of the hydrological cycle. Rain that falls on the ridges above filters down through soil and stone, joining the slow movement of groundwater through the aquifer. Where the water table intersects the land surface, springs emerge, cold and clear, fed by a reservoir of stone. For the ecosystems that depend on them, these springs are lifelines. The water that flows from them has been filtered through layers of rock, emerging clean and at a constant temperature year-round. In summer, when surface streams run low, the springs continue to flow. In winter, they remain unfrozen, their water warmed slightly by its journey through the earth. Plants cluster around them. Animals come to drink. Humans, when they first arrived in these mountains, built their settlements near reliable springs, knowing that water meant survival. But the underground rivers are more than just water sources. They are ecosystems in themselves, home to species that have adapted to life in perpetual darkness. Cave fish, translucent and eyeless, navigate by sensing pressure changes in the water. Cave crayfish, pale as ghosts, scavenge along the gravel bottoms of underground streams. Salamanders, including some species found nowhere else on Earth, breed in the cold water of cave pools, their larvae drifting in currents that never see the sun. These creatures are not primitive or unchanged. They are highly specialized, evolved over millions of years to thrive in an environment that would be lethal to most surface-dwelling animals. They are also fragile. Cave ecosystems depend on a delicate balance of nutrients, usually organic matter washed in from the surface, detritus and leaves, and the occasional drowned insect. Pollution from the surface, agricultural runoff, chemical spills, even changes in the water table caused by development can devastate these hidden communities. Speleology, the scientific study of caves, is a relatively young discipline. For much of history, caves were regarded with suspicion or indifference, places to avoid or exploit, not to study. It was not until the 20th century that systematic cave exploration and mapping began in earnest, led by scientists and recreational cavers who understood that these underground spaces held scientific value. In the Blue Ridge, speleologists have mapped hundreds of caves, documenting their passages, their hydrology, their formations. But mapping a cave is not like mapping the surface. It requires crawling through tight squeezes, wading through icy water, climbing vertical pitches, all while taking measurements and sketching the route. A single cave system can take years to fully explore, and even then, new passages are sometimes discovered, overlooked branches that were missed on earlier surveys. And for every cave that has been mapped, there are likely others that remain unknown, their entrances hidden or blocked, their passages still pristine and untouched. The question we might ask ourselves as we consider these hidden rivers is this: how much of the water beneath our feet moves through spaces we have never seen? How many chambers fill and drain with the seasons, their walls reflecting patterns of flowstone that no light has ever revealed? How many underground streams carry the mountain's memory, dissolving and redepositing stone, grain by grain, in the silent dark? Long before European settlers arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, long before surveyors drew their lines or hunters blazed their trails, people lived in these valleys and moved through these forests. They were not visitors. They were not discoverers. They were people for whom these mountains were home, ancestors stretching back thousands of years, their knowledge of the land passed down through generations in stories, songs, and the careful observation of the world around them. The Cherokee called portions of the Blue Ridge their territory, though the concept of territory as colonists understood it, fixed and bounded, did not fully capture the indigenous understanding of land and belonging. The Cherokee knew the mountains as a living place, layered with meaning and memory. Peaks were named. Valleys held stories, springs were sacred, and caves, those openings into the dark body of the earth, were places of power and caution, thresholds between worlds. To the east and north, the Monacan and other Siouan-speaking peoples lived along the river valleys that drained from the Blue Ridge. Their settlements clustered near water, their travel routes followed ridgelines and gaps through the mountains. They hunted deer and elk in the forests. They gathered roots and nuts. They shaped the land with fire, burning underbrush to encourage new growth, creating the open woodlands that early European explorers mistook for wilderness. The archaeological record in the Blue Ridge is fragmentary but revealing. Stone tools, some dating back 10,000 years or more, have been found in rock shelters and cave entrances, evidence of Paleo-Indian and archaic peoples who used these places as temporary camps. Pottery sherds from the woodland period appear in some cave sediments, suggesting that people continued to use these spaces for shelter or storage over millennia. Charcoal stains on cave walls in a few documented cases mark where fires were built, their smoke rising towards stone ceilings in the cold months when warmth meant survival. But archaeological evidence can only tell us so much. It records presence, activity, the physical traces of human life. It cannot easily capture belief, meaning, or the stories people told about the places they inhabited. For that, we turn to oral traditions, and here we must be careful to distinguish between what has been documented and preserved by indigenous communities themselves, and what has been filtered, translated, or reshaped through layers of colonial recording. Cherokee oral traditions, as recorded by ethnographers and preserved by tribal historians, speak of caves as places of emergence and transformation. Some stories describe the Nunehi spirit people who lived inside the mountains, invisible most of the time, but sometimes appearing to help travelers or warn of danger. Other stories tell of powerful beings dwelling in deep places, guardians or dangers that required respect. These are not superstitions to be dismissed. They are expressions of a worldview in which the landscape itself is animate, responsive, deserving of careful relationship. To enter a cave was not simply to walk into an empty space. It was to enter a place with its own presence, its own rules. Springs, particularly those emerging from caves or rock faces, held special significance. Water from deep within the earth was understood as powerful, sometimes healing, sometimes dangerous. Archaeological surveys have identified offerings left near certain springs, small deposits of carved stones or shaped objects, though interpreting their meaning across centuries requires humility and caution. What we can say with confidence is that these were not random acts. They were intentional, evidence of spiritual practice tied to specific places in the landscape. The Cherokee also possessed detailed practical knowledge of the mountains and their hidden features. They knew which caves provided reliable shelter from storms. They knew where cold air flowed from underground passages, even in summer, natural refrigeration that could preserve meat or roots. They knew which springs ran year-round and which dried up in late summer. This was survival knowledge, refined over generations, and it included an understanding of the underground that European settlers would take much longer to develop. Travel routes through the Blue Ridge followed paths that minimized effort and maximized safety. Gaps where ridges dipped low enough to cross without climbing to the peaks. River valleys that provided level ground and fresh water. These routes were not accidental. They had been chosen, used, maintained. Some were marked with carved trees or stone cairns, though most such markers have long since vanished, rotted, or overgrown or removed. When archaeologists conduct surveys in the Blue Ridge today, they sometimes find evidence of indigenous presence in unexpected places. A scattering of worked flint in a high valley, miles from any known settlement. A rock overhang with soot stains on the ceiling, suggesting repeated use as a shelter. In a few cases, markings on cave walls, simple geometric shapes or handprints, though dating such markings is notoriously difficult, and without additional context, their meaning remains uncertain. What we know for certain is this: the Blue Ridge Mountains were not empty when colonists arrived. They were known, inhabited, layered with human memory and meaning. The caves were part of that inhabited world, and the people who lived here possessed knowledge of the underground that was later forgotten or dismissed. In the 18th century, as European settlement expanded, indigenous peoples were displaced through violence, disease, and forced removal. With them went much of the accumulated knowledge of the land. The Cherokee were driven west along the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, a catastrophe that severed generations of connection to these mountains. The Monacan and other groups faced similar disruptions, their communities fragmented, their languages and traditions suppressed. Some knowledge survived. Some was written down, though often by outsiders who misunderstood or simplified what they heard. Some was preserved within families and communities, carried forward despite everything. But much was lost, including, almost certainly, knowledge of caves and springs and underground places that are now forgotten. When we explore the caves of the Blue Ridge today, we walk in the wake of that loss. We rediscover passages that were known long ago. We map chambers that people once sheltered in, their presence now reduced to faint traces in the soil. And we must remember that our explorations are not the first. The darkness has been entered before by people whose relationship to the earth was deeper and longer than ours. The frontier moved slowly through the Blue Ridge Mountains, not as a single wave, but as a gradual seepage of hunters, traders, and settlers, pushing west from the colonial settlements along the Atlantic coast. By the early 1700s, the Piedmont and the eastern slopes of the Blue Ridge were being surveyed and claimed. By mid-century, explorers were crossing the mountains, venturing into the valleys beyond. These were not official expeditions for the most part. They were solitary hunters or small groups of men seeking land, furs, or simply the freedom of distance from colonial authority. They traveled light, carried rifles and little else, and they learned the landscape by moving through it, by trial and error, by listening to guides who knew the terrain, or by observing the traces left by others. The Long Hunters, as they came to be known, were among the first Europeans to spend extended time in the Blue Ridge backcountry. They would leave settlements in Virginia or the Carolinas in autumn and disappear into the mountains for months at a time, hunting deer and elk, trapping beaver, curing hides, and caching their goods in caves or hollow trees until they could carry them back to trade. The term Long Hunter referred to the length of these expeditions, journeys that might last an entire winter far beyond the reach of roads or law. Caves were essential to the Long Hunters. They provided shelter from rain and snow. They offered concealment from unfriendly eyes, whether indigenous warriors defending their territory or rival hunters. They were natural storage, cool and dry, where bundled furs and smoked meat could be hidden until retrieval. Some caves became known landmarks, referenced in the journals and letters of the period, though the descriptions were often vague, too imprecise to identify the exact locations today. One account, written in 1761 by a surveyor named William Churton, describes a large cave in the Blue Ridge where his party sheltered during a storm. He writes of a passage that extended far back into the mountain, filled with the sound of running water, though his group did not explore beyond the entrance chamber. Whether this cave has been rediscovered or remains lost, obscured by 2.5 centuries of forest growth, is uncertain. Another traveler, a trader named James Patton, kept a journal during his travels through southwestern Virginia in the 1740s. He mentions several caves used as resting points along established trails, one of which he describes as having curious stone icicles hanging from the ceiling, an early description of stalactites. Patton's journal also notes a cave with ancient markings on the walls, though whether these were indigenous carvings or natural patterns in the rock, he does not say. His descriptions are tantalizing but frustratingly incomplete, the observations of a man interested primarily in commerce, not scientific documentation. The colonial surveyors faced different challenges. Their task was to impose order on the landscape, to divide it into parcels that could be claimed, bought, and sold. But surveying in the Blue Ridge was difficult, dangerous work. Dense forest made sightlines nearly impossible. Steep slopes exhausted men and animals. And the karst terrain, with its sinkholes and caves and underground drainage, confounded attempts to establish clear boundaries. Property lines were often marked by natural features, a large oak tree, a prominent boulder, a spring. But springs could dry up or change location as underground drainage shifted. Trees could fall or be cut down. Without permanent markers and accurate maps, disputes were common. Some surveyors, recognizing the importance of caves as landmarks, included them in their descriptions, noting a cave mouth at the base of a certain ridge or a large cavern near a creek crossing. These references appear in land grants and deeds from the colonial period, fragments of geographic knowledge scattered through legal documents. As settlement increased, so did the accumulation of local knowledge about the caves. Farmers discovered sinkholes on their land, some shallow and harmless, others deep and dangerous. Millers found springs that provided reliable water to turn their wheels. Children explored small caves near their homes, bringing back stories of bats and bones and darkness that seemed to go on forever. But this knowledge was rarely written down. It circulated orally, shared among neighbors, passed from one generation to the next. A few caves gained names: Blowing Cave or Whistling Cave or Bat Cave, descriptive titles that captured something of their character. Others remained unnamed, known only to the families who lived nearby. The Revolutionary War brought new uses for the caves of the Blue Ridge. Saltpeter, a key ingredient in gunpowder, could be mined from cave sediments where bat guano had accumulated over centuries. Enterprising individuals, motivated by patriotism or profit, ventured into known caves to extract the nitrate-rich soil, processing it in crude refineries near the cave entrances. Evidence of this activity remains in some caves today: old wooden vats and leaching troughs rotting in the darkness, the last remnants of a forgotten wartime industry. By the early 1800s, the frontier had moved further west, but the Blue Ridge remained a place apart, a region of small farms and isolated communities, connected to the wider world by rough roads and river transport. Caves continued to serve practical purposes. They were used to store vegetables and milk, their cool temperatures acting as natural refrigerators. They were used to age cheese and cure ham. Moonshiners, in later years, would use remote caves to hide their stills, the constant temperature and water supply making them ideal for illegal distilling. Exploration in the scientific sense was still rare. Most people who entered caves did so for practical reasons, not curiosity. The idea of mapping a cave system, of documenting its passages and formations simply to know what was there, was not yet common. Caves were resources or obstacles or places to avoid, not objects of systematic study. But there were exceptions. Thomas Jefferson, scholar and naturalist, as well as politician, took an interest in the caves of Virginia. He visited several, including Madison's Cave in the Shenandoah Valley, and he corresponded with others about their observations. In his notes on the state of Virginia, published in 1785, Jefferson describes cave formations and speculates about their origins, demonstrating a curiosity that was ahead of his time. He also notes the discovery of ancient bones in some caves, remains of creatures he could not identify, evidence of a world that existed long before human history. Jefferson's interest was unusual but not unique. A small number of educated travelers and natural philosophers began to see caves as worthy of attention, places where the Earth's processes could be observed and studied. But for most people living in the Blue Ridge, caves remained what they had always been: useful, mysterious, and largely unexplored. The maps of the period show the mountains in increasing detail, rivers and roads and settlements marked with growing precision. But the underground remained absent, invisible, known only to those who had reason to venture into the dark. The true extent of the cave systems beneath the Blue Ridge, the miles of passages and chambers and underground rivers, would not be revealed for more than a century. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in caves. It is not the silence of a quiet room, where you can still hear the hum of distant traffic or the creak of a settling building. It is total, absolute, the absence of sound so complete that you become aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the faint whisper of blood moving through your ears. In this silence, the cave becomes a refuge, a place cut off from the surface world, hidden and protected. Throughout human history, people have sought such refuges. In times of conflict, displacement, or persecution, when the surface world becomes too dangerous, the underground offers concealment. Caves do not appear on most maps. They can be defended from a single entrance. They provide shelter from the elements, and if they contain water, everything needed for survival. For those with no other options, a cave can mean the difference between capture and freedom, between death and survival. In the Blue Ridge Mountains, the historical record contains scattered references to caves being used as places of refuge, though the evidence is often fragmentary, requiring careful interpretation to separate documented facts from later embellishments or folklore. During the colonial period and the early years of the American Republic, the Blue Ridge was a borderland, contested and unstable. Conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples, between rival colonial powers, and later between patriot and loyalist forces during the Revolution, created a landscape of uncertainty and violence. People caught in these conflicts sometimes fled to remote areas, seeking places where they could hide until the danger passed. Some settlers, attacked during raids, are recorded as having sheltered in caves for days at a time, waiting for rescue or for the attackers to move on. These accounts appear in family histories and local chronicles, though details are often sparse. A family hiding in a cave with their livestock, keeping the animals quiet, rationing what food they had carried with them. The fear of discovery, the cold and darkness. The relief of emerging, finally, to find their homestead burned, but their lives intact. There are also traditions, harder to verify but persistent, of deserters from various armies using caves as hideouts. Men who refused conscription or who fled the battlefield, living rough in the mountains, avoiding patrols. The caves provided concealment and a base from which to forage or steal what they needed. Some of these men eventually returned to society. Others, according to local stories, remained in the mountains for years, becoming semi-mythical figures, wild men glimpsed at a distance but never caught. The question of maroon communities in the Blue Ridge, groups of people who escaped enslavement and established hidden settlements in remote areas, is one where we must tread carefully and distinguish between what historical scholarship can confirm and what remains speculative or based on oral tradition. Marronage, the act of escaping slavery and forming independent communities, is well documented in other parts of the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean, the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, and certain areas of the Deep South. These communities, sometimes called maroon communities, varied in size and duration. Some lasted for generations, others were temporary refuges, way stations on routes to freedom further north. In the Blue Ridge, the evidence for such communities is less clear, but it is not absent. The mountains were rugged and difficult to patrol, making them plausible refuges. There are documented cases of individuals who escaped enslavement and hid in the mountains for periods of time. supported by networks of free black families, sympathetic whites, or other escapees. Whether any of these individuals or groups used caves as long-term shelters is a question that historical records do not definitively answer, but it is a reasonable possibility. Archaeologist and historian Dr. Daniel Sayers has conducted extensive research on maroon landscapes in the Great Dismal Swamp, demonstrating how archaeological evidence can reveal communities that left little trace in written records. His work has inspired similar investigations in other regions, including parts of Appalachia. In the Blue Ridge, some archaeological surveys have identified artifact scatters in remote areas that suggest temporary occupation by people who were living outside the documented settlement patterns of the period. These could represent hunting camps, hermit homesteads, or something else entirely. Without more evidence, firm conclusions are difficult. What we can say with confidence is that caves, throughout the history of the Blue Ridge, provided refuge for people in various circumstances. Some of this use is documented. Much of it likely went unrecorded, the actions of people who had reason to avoid official notice, whose survival depended on remaining invisible. Oral traditions in some African American communities in Appalachia preserve stories of ancestors who hid in caves, either temporarily while escaping or for longer periods. These traditions deserve respect and attention, even as we acknowledge that oral history and documented history are not always the same thing. Stories passed down through families carry truth, but it is truth of a different kind, shaped by memory and meaning, not always anchored to specific dates or places. In the years following the Civil War, the Blue Ridge remained a place where people could disappear if they needed to. Outlaws fleeing justice or revenge, families escaping debt or blood feuds, individuals seeking solitude or running from their own pasts. The mountains asked few questions, the caves asked none. Some of these later occupations left traces that spelunkers and archaeologists have discovered. In certain caves, crude shelters built from stacked stone and timber, the wood now rotted, but the arrangement still visible. Fire-blackened rocks from cooking hearths. Rusted cans and broken bottles from the late 19th or early 20th century, evidence of someone living rough, using the cave as a base. Initials and dates scratched into cave walls, some with messages, John Miller was here 1867, or God have mercy. These traces are poignant, small windows into lives lived at the margins. We do not know most of their stories. We do not know what drove them underground or what became of them. The caves kept them hidden then, and the caves keep their secrets still. There is something humbling about standing in a cave that was once someone's refuge, imagining what it must have been like to live here, to wake in total darkness, to ration food and water, to listen for footsteps at the entrance. The stone around you is indifferent, ancient, unchanged by human presence, but for the person sheltering here, this stone meant safety. It meant survival. It meant, for a while, freedom. As we consider these hidden places and the people who sought them, we might ask ourselves, how many stories have been lost? How many lives passed through these caves, leaving no record we can read? The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the silence of the archives does not mean that nothing happened. It means only that some histories are harder to recover than others, written not in documents, but in memory, whispered in families, or kept secret until there was no one left to tell. The caves of the Blue Ridge have witnessed much. They have sheltered the desperate and the defiant, the fleeing and the forgotten, and they remain, patient and dark, holding what traces they still possess. Sound behaves strangely underground. In the open air, sound waves travel outward and dissipate, absorbed by trees and soil and the vastness of sky. But in a cave, sound has nowhere to go. It bounces off stone walls, reflects back on itself, creates patterns of echo and resonance that can transform a whisper into something uncanny. If you were to stand in the entrance of a large cave and speak a single word, you might hear it return to you a second later, then again, fainter, then again, each repetition slightly altered, stretched, or compressed by the shape of the passage. Move deeper into the cave, into chambers with high ceilings and irregular walls, and the acoustics become more complex. A handclap might produce a sharp crack that reverberates for several seconds. A shout might seem to come from multiple directions at once, as if the stone itself was speaking. These are not supernatural phenomena. They are physics, the predictable behavior of sound waves in enclosed spaces. But to someone unfamiliar with acoustics, to someone alone in the dark with only a flickering torch for light, these echoes could be profoundly disorienting, even frightening. Cave passages can also produce sound without any human input. Air currents, driven by temperature differences between the cave interior and the outside atmosphere, flow through openings and constrictions, creating whistles, moans, or deep hums. A narrow crack in the rock, with air rushing through it, can produce a tone like a distant wind instrument. A vertical shaft, functioning as a natural chimney, might create a low rumbling as air rises or falls. Water, too, contributes to the soundscape. Dripping water, the steady percussion of drops falling from ceiling to floor, sometimes landing in pools that amplify the sound. Underground streams, their flow echoing off stone banks, creating a constant murmur that pervades certain cave systems. Waterfalls, roaring in chambers where rivers drop suddenly, the noise so loud it makes conversation impossible, vibrations felt as much as heard. Low-frequency sounds are particularly interesting. Human ears are less sensitive to very low frequencies, sounds below 20 Hz or so, but we can still perceive them as pressure or vibration rather than as distinct tones. Caves, because of their structure, can generate and amplify these infrasounds. Moving water, collapsing rock, even the subtle settling of geological formations, all can produce low-frequency vibrations that propagate through stone and air alike. Research in acoustic archaeology, a field that studies how sound behaves in ancient structures and natural spaces, has shown that certain caves have resonant frequencies, specific tones that the space naturally amplifies. When someone speaks or sings at that frequency, the sound becomes much louder, filling the cave with vibration. Some researchers have speculated that ancient peoples might have been aware of these properties, using caves with particular acoustics for ritual or ceremonial purposes, though proving this requires both acoustic measurements and archaeological evidence. In the Blue Ridge, No systematic acoustic survey of the cave systems has been published, but cavers have long noted that some caves seem to amplify sound in unusual ways, while others dampen it, swallowing noise as if the stone were absorbing it. Then there is the darkness itself and what it does to the human mind. Complete darkness, the kind found deep in a cave beyond any trace of daylight, is an experience most modern humans never encounter. Our world is full of light, streetlights and screens, and the faint glow of electronics. Even at night, even with eyes closed, there is rarely true absence of light. But in a cave, once you move beyond the twilight zone near the entrance, darkness becomes absolute. You can hold your hand an inch from your face and see nothing. Your eyes strain, searching for any input, and find none. This sensory deprivation affects perception. Without visual reference, your sense of balance can falter. Time becomes difficult to judge. Your other senses sharpen by necessity. You become acutely aware of sound, of the texture of stone beneath your hands, of the smell of wet rock and mineral deposits. Some people find this disorienting, even disturbing. Others describe it as peaceful, a kind of enforced meditation. Psychological studies of cavers and people placed in extended darkness have documented various responses. Some individuals report heightened alertness, a feeling of being watched, though they know rationally that they are alone. Others experience auditory hallucinations, hearing voices or music that is not there, the brain inventing input where none exists. These are normal responses to an abnormal environment, the mind attempting to make sense of conditions it did not evolve to navigate. Given all of this, the sound, the darkness, the strangeness of being inside the earth, it is no wonder that caves have inspired folklore and legends throughout human history. And in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the oral traditions of Appalachia have woven the caves into a rich tapestry of stories, some cautionary, some explanatory, some simply meant to entertain or frighten. It is important to state clearly, what follows is folklore, not historical fact. These are stories, the imaginative culture of the region, and they tell us something about how people related to the caves, but they are not documentation of actual events. In Appalachian tradition, caves were often associated with the uncanny. There were stories of people who entered caves and never returned, swallowed by the mountain. Stories of strange lights seen deep underground, glowing with no apparent source. Stories of voices heard calling from the darkness, leading travelers astray or warning them of danger. Some tales spoke of creatures living in the deepest caves, things that were neither animal nor human, adapted to the dark, emerging only at night. These might have been inspired by actual cave fauna, bats and salamanders and insects, seen briefly and misunderstood, their pale bodies and strange movements transformed by fear and imagination into something monstrous. Other stories were more explicitly supernatural. Ghosts of people who had died in the caves, killed by floods or rockfalls, or simply lost in the labyrinth, their spirits trapped underground. Witches who used caves as meeting places or as portals to other realms. Devil figures who claimed certain caves as their own, and woe to anyone who trespassed. One recurring motif in Appalachian cave folklore is the idea of the endless passage, a tunnel that goes on forever, deeper and deeper into the earth, with no end and no way back. To enter such a passage was to risk being lost not just physically, but existentially, removed from the world of the living. This story might reflect the very real danger of getting lost in a complex cave system, where passages branch and loop, where landmarks are few, and where panic can lead to fatal decisions. There were also gentler stories. Tales of hidden treasure in caves, left by Spanish explorers or Confederate soldiers, guarded by curses or spirits, but waiting for someone brave or clever enough to claim it. These treasure legends are common throughout Appalachia, and while they are almost never based on fact, they have motivated countless searches, some of which led to actual cave discoveries, though never to gold. Some communities developed specific superstitions about local caves. A cave where the wind always blew outward was considered unlucky, a place to avoid. A cave with a particular rock formation that resembled a human face or an animal was treated with respect, sometimes left offerings even into the 20th century. A spring emerging from a cave might be said to have healing properties or, conversely, to cause illness if the water was taken without permission. These beliefs were not universal. They varied from valley to valley, family to family. But they created a cultural landscape in which caves were marked as significant liminal spaces, neither fully part of the human world nor entirely wild, places that required caution and respect. Folklorists who have studied Appalachian oral traditions note that many cave stories serve practical purposes. They teach children to stay away from dangerous places. They encode environmental knowledge in memorable narrative form. They provide explanations for natural phenomena that might otherwise be frightening or inexplicable, and perhaps in a deeper way. These stories acknowledge something true, that there are places in the world that remain beyond our full understanding, places where the familiar rules do not quite apply, where the darkness is total and the silence is complete, and the earth reminds us how small we are. When we explore caves today, equipped with electric lights and maps and communication devices, we do so with knowledge and tools that protect us from most of the dangers and uncertainties that our ancestors faced. But the cave itself has not changed. The echoes still multiply in the darkness. The stone still swallows sound and light. And if we stand very still and turn off our lights, we can feel for a moment what it might have been like to enter this space with nothing but a torch and our courage, not knowing what lay ahead, carrying the weight of all the stories we had heard. There is a moment when you first enter a well-decorated cave chamber, when your light sweeps across the walls and you see not rock but something that resembles frozen water or melted wax, or the fantastic architecture of a dream. The stone flows, it drips. It builds itself into columns and curtains and delicate needles that seem impossibly fragile. The colors shift, white and orange and brown, and sometimes pale pink or translucent amber. You are standing inside a sculpture gallery that has been under construction for millennia, and every surface is a work in progress. These formations are called speleothems, from the Greek words for cave and deposit. They are secondary mineral deposits, created by the deposition of minerals from water as it moves through the cave. The process is slow beyond human comprehension, measured in centuries and millennia, but the results are among the most beautiful natural phenomena on Earth. The most familiar speleothems are stalactites and stalagmites, though the two are often confused. A simple way to remember: stalactites grow down from the ceiling, holding tight to the rock above. Stalagmites grow up from the floor, reaching toward the ceiling with might. Both are formed by the same process, just in different locations. Water seeping through soil and limestone above the cave becomes saturated with dissolved calcium carbonate. When this water reaches the cave ceiling and emerges as a drip, carbon dioxide escapes into the cave air, and a tiny amount of calcite precipitates out, forming a mineral ring around the drip point. Over time, this ring extends downward, building a hollow tube called a soda straw, as thin as a few millimeters in diameter, but potentially several feet long. If the tube becomes blocked, or if water begins flowing down the outside of the formation, the stalactite thickens, developing the classic conical shape. Below, where the water drips hit the cave floor, the same chemical process deposits calcite, building a stalagmite upward. If a cave remains stable for long enough, a stalactite and stalagmite may eventually meet, fusing into a column that spans floor to ceiling, a pillar of stone grown one molecule at a time. But stalactites and stalagmites are only the beginning. Flowstone forms where water flows in sheets down cave walls or across floors, depositing layers of calcite that build up into smooth, rippling surfaces, sometimes resembling frozen waterfalls. The colors in flowstone come from trace minerals in the water: iron oxides producing orange and rust tones, manganese creating darker browns and blacks, and pure calcite forming white or translucent deposits. Draperies or curtains are thin, wavy sheets of calcite that form where water flows along a slanted ceiling, depositing minerals in delicate, folded layers. If you shine a light through a thin section of drapery, it may glow, translucent and amber, like stained glass. Cave pearls, small round formations, develop in shallow pools where water drips steadily, rotating a grain of sand or rock fragment and coating it with concentric layers of calcite, building up a smooth sphere over decades. Helictites are among the most mysterious speleothems, formations that seem to defy gravity, growing in twisted, curved, or spiral shapes that cannot be explained by simple dripping water. Their formation mechanism is still debated, but it likely involves capillary action, crystallization pressure, and air currents, processes that operate at such a small scale that they can push the formation in directions gravity alone would not predict. In the Blue Ridge Caves, speleothems vary widely depending on the hydrology and chemistry of each system. Some caves are richly decorated, their chambers filled with formations so dense you must navigate carefully to avoid damaging them. Others are relatively bare, their walls scoured by ancient floods or their chemical conditions not conducive to deposition. Dr. Carol Hill, a geologist who has extensively studied cave minerals, documented over 300 different cave minerals worldwide, though calcite remains by far the most common. In certain rare cases, caves can contain formations of aragonite, a different crystal structure of calcium carbonate that forms delicate needles or clusters. Others may have gypsum formations, soft white flowers or needles growing from the walls in dry sections of cave. Still others contain rare minerals like anthodites, moonmilk, or cave rafts, each requiring specific conditions to form. The formations are fragile in ways that are not immediately obvious. A stalactite that took 10,000 years to grow can be broken off in a second by careless contact. Oils from human skin, transferred to the surface of a formation, can halt its growth by preventing water from depositing minerals. Foot traffic in a cave can stir up sediment, change airflow patterns, or introduce contaminants that alter the delicate chemistry of formation development. This is why cave conservation has become a priority for speleologists and land managers. Many caves in the Blue Ridge that once allowed unrestricted access are now gated or require permits, not to keep people out arbitrarily, but to protect formations that are irreplaceable. Once destroyed, they cannot be restored within any human timescale, but caves are not just mineral galleries. They are ecosystems, and some of the most fascinating life in the Blue Ridge exists in these dark, stable environments. Cave ecosystems are limited by energy. On the surface, sunlight powers photosynthesis, which forms the base of the food web. But in caves, there is no light, no photosynthesis, and therefore very little energy. Most cave organisms depend on organic matter imported from outside, leaves and twigs washed in by flooding, animal droppings from bats or pack rats, the occasional carcass of an animal that fell through a sinkhole. Cave fauna can be divided into three categories. Troglodytes are species that use caves but also live outside, bats and cave crickets, and the occasional salamander sheltering from winter cold. Troglophiles are species that can complete their life cycle in caves but are also found in surface habitats, certain spiders and beetles. And troglodytes are species that live only in caves, never venturing into sunlight, highly adapted and often bizarre. Troglodytes in the Blue Ridge include several species of cave salamanders, some of which are found nowhere else in the world. These salamanders are often pale, sometimes nearly translucent, their skin lacking the pigmentation that would protect them from sunlight they never see. Some species have reduced or absent eyes, navigating instead by sensing chemical gradients and water currents. They are slow-moving, long-lived, and reproduce infrequently, adaptations to an environment where food is scarce and predictability is key to survival. Cave fish, though less common in the Blue Ridge than in some other karst regions, do exist in certain systems. Like the salamanders, they are often eyeless and unpigmented, their lateral line systems highly developed to sense vibrations in the water. They feed on tiny invertebrates, cave isopods and amphipods, which in turn feed on organic detritus and bacteria. Cave crickets, also called camel crickets for their humped appearance, are common in Blue Ridge caves. They are troglophiles, emerging from caves at night to forage on the surface and returning to the cave to rest during the day. Their presence provides an important energy link, as their droppings and eventually their bodies contribute nutrients to the cave ecosystem. In some caves, particularly those with bat colonies, the floor may be covered with guano, centuries of accumulated droppings that support a specialized community of fungi, mites, beetles, and other decomposers. Bats themselves are critical to many cave ecosystems, not only because of the nutrients they provide, but also because their populations are indicators of environmental health. The Blue Ridge is home to several bat species that use caves for hibernation, including the endangered Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat. During winter, these bats enter a state of torpor, their body temperature dropping, their metabolism slowing, allowing them to survive months without food. They cluster on cave ceilings in specific chambers where temperature and humidity remain constant, conditions found only deep within certain caves. In recent years, white nose syndrome, a fungal disease, has devastated bat populations across eastern North America. The fungus thrives in the cool, humid conditions of caves and infects hibernating bats, causing them to wake frequently, burn through their fat reserves, and often die before spring. Efforts to combat the disease include cave closures during hibernation season, decontamination protocols for cavers, and research into treatments and resistant bat populations. Cave mosses and liverworts exist in the twilight zones near cave entrances, where some light still penetrates. These plants cling to damp rock, their green presence a gradual fade as light diminishes, marking the transition from the surface world to the deep cave environment. Even bacteria and fungi play crucial roles. In some caves, microbial mats cover walls and formations, creating subtle biofilms that process minerals and organic matter. These microorganisms are being studied for their potential biotechnological applications as they survive in extreme conditions with limited resources. What strikes the observer moving through a well-preserved cave is the completeness of these small worlds. Everything is connected. The drip of water feeds the formation and the pool below. The pool supports the amphipods. The amphipods feed the salamander. The salamander, when it dies, feeds the bacteria, which in turn influence the water chemistry. It is a closed loop, slow and efficient, balanced over evolutionary time. To stand in such a place, among the flowstone and the silent creatures, is to witness an alternative to the noise and speed of the surface world. Here, patience is the governing principle. Here, everything happens in its own time, indifferent to human urgency. And here, perhaps, we can begin to understand what it means to think in geological time, to measure change not in years, but in millennia, to see ourselves as brief visitors in a story much longer than our own. Human hands leave traces. We carve and scratch and write, marking our presence on the surfaces we encounter. And caves, with their stable environments and protected walls, preserve these marks far better than the open air, where wind and rain erase them within decades. In the caves of the Blue Ridge, the walls hold a record of visitation that stretches back in time, a palimpsest of names and dates and symbols, some clear, some nearly invisible, some whose meaning has been lost. Reading these marks is an exercise in archaeology and detective work, piecing together who came here, when, and why. The oldest marks are the hardest to interpret. In a few Blue Ridge caves, archaeologists have documented what appear to be intentional markings on walls near the entrance, simple geometric shapes or lines scratched or carved into the stone. Dating such carvings is difficult. Unlike organic material, stone cannot be radiocarbon dated, and unless the carving is covered by a datable layer of flowstone or sediment, its age remains uncertain. Some researchers have suggested that certain markings might be indigenous, created by the people who lived in these mountains before European contact. The patterns, simple crosses or parallel lines or circles, do not obviously match any known Cherokee or Monacan symbolic systems, but that does not rule out indigenous origin. Symbols change over time, and much of the visual culture of southeastern indigenous peoples was not preserved or was misunderstood by early colonial observers. Without additional context, firm attribution is impossible. What we can say is that some of these marks are old, weathered into the stone in a way that suggests centuries rather than decades, and that they represent intentional human expression in a space that held meaning for the person who made them. More recently, from the 18th and 19th centuries onward, names and dates appear with increasing frequency. These are the marks of hunters, surveyors, travelers, and the simply curious, people who ventured into the cave and wanted to leave evidence of their presence. Some of these inscriptions are crude, names scratched with a knife blade or a sharp stone, barely legible. Others are more elaborate, carved carefully in block letters, sometimes with flourishes or decorative elements. Dates range from the 1700s to the present, a chronological record of visitation. Reading these names is an odd kind of intimacy. Joseph Turner, 1792. Who was Joseph Turner? What brought him to this cave? Did he shelter here during a storm, or was he exploring out of curiosity? Did he come alone, or with companions whose names he did not record? We will almost certainly never know, but his name remains, carved into the stone, a small claim against oblivion. Some inscriptions include more information. J. Miller and party passed here May 14, 1834. Found bear in this cave, killed it, praise God. Sheltered here 3 days, river too high. These fragments offer glimpses into the experiences that brought people underground, moments of success or difficulty, ordinary lives intersecting with the cave's long existence. Charcoal drawings appear in some caves, smoke residue from torches used to create simple images or marks on the walls. These are even more vulnerable to deterioration than carvings, as they can be smudged or washed away, but in dry sections of cave, they sometimes survive for centuries. Most charcoal marks are simple, handprints or tally marks, but a few are more complex, crude drawings of animals or human figures. Survey markers from various eras indicate efforts to map or claim the cave. Metal tags hammered into the rock, stamped with dates and initials. Paint marks, now faded, indicating routes or boundaries. In a few cases, actual survey equipment was left behind, wooden tripods or iron stakes, now rusted and rotting but still recognizable. Trail symbols, small cairns or scratches mark routes through more complex cave systems. Early explorers, lacking modern mapping tools, needed ways to avoid getting lost, and the simplest method was to mark the path as you went, creating a trail you could follow back to the entrance. Some of these trails are still visible, small piles of stones at junctions or scratches on prominent formations, though following them today with better lights and maps, is no longer necessary. The archaeological interpretation of these marks requires careful methodology. Simply photographing or cataloging them is a start, but understanding their context, their relationship to other features in the cave, and their place in the broader history of the region requires expertise. Dr. Jan Simek, an archaeologist at the University of Tennessee, has pioneered the study of cave art and inscription in the Southeast. His work in Tennessee caves has revealed complex patterns of indigenous cave use, including ceremonial art created deep underground, far beyond the reach of daylight. While his specific research has not focused on the Blue Ridge, his methods have influenced how other researchers approach cave archaeology in the region. One challenge is distinguishing between historically significant marks and modern graffiti. A name carved in 1800 has historical value, providing data about who was accessing remote areas and when. A name spray-painted in 1995 is vandalism, damaging the cave and obscuring older marks. But the line is not always clear. At what point does a mark transition from graffiti to historical artifact? 50 years, 100? There is no consensus, but the general principle in cave conservation is that no new marks should be made, that the cave should be left as undisturbed as possible for both scientific study and the experience of future visitors. Preservation of existing marks is also a concern. Some caves have seen well-meaning but misguided attempts to restore old carvings by recarving them or tracing over them, which destroys their original character and makes them useless for historical study. Others have had marks deliberately defaced by vandals or damaged accidentally by cavers brushing against them. Modern cave management often includes documentation projects, photographing and recording all inscriptions and markings in a cave, creating an archive that will survive even if the originals deteriorate. Three-dimensional scanning technology allows researchers to create detailed models of inscribed surfaces, capturing texture and depth in ways that photographs cannot. Some marks raise questions that may never be answered. In one Blue Ridge cave, a survey in the 1980s documented a series of tally marks on a wall deep in the system, groups of 5 lines in the traditional counting pattern, totaling over 200 marks. No name, no date, no explanation. Was someone counting days, counting something they found or harvested in the cave, marking trips in and out? The marks are old, the stone around them darkened with age, but without more information, their purpose remains a mystery. In another cave, a carved image of what appears to be a fish, or perhaps a salamander, rendered in simple lines. It is located in a chamber near an underground stream, which might explain the aquatic subject, but who carved it, and when, and why, is unknown. These mysteries are part of what makes the study of cave inscriptions compelling. Each mark is a message from the past, but often a message we can no longer fully read. The names remain, outlasting the people who carved them, but the context, the stories, the reasons, these fade into silence. As we move through these marked passages, aware of the layers of human presence recorded on the walls, we might consider our own relationship to the practice of leaving marks. The impulse to say, "I was here," is deeply human, a small assertion of existence, a wish to be remembered. But in a cave, where preservation is paramount and where the stone records everything, perhaps the better choice is to leave no trace at all, to pass through in silence, and to carry the memory of the place within ourselves rather than inscribing ourselves upon it. The cave does not need our names to continue existing, but we, perhaps, need to learn the humility of visiting a place that was here long before us and will remain long after, offering it the respect of our attention without demanding that it remember us in return. The science of cave exploration has changed dramatically in the last century. Where once a caver ventured underground with little more than a candle or carbide lamp, a ball of string to mark the route, and hope, today's speleologists carry technology that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. LED headlamps that burn for days on a single charge, GPS units that can maintain accuracy even hundreds of feet underground by using specialized antenna arrays, laser rangefinders that measure distance with millimeter precision, portable computers that allow real-time mapping in the cave itself. But technology has not eliminated the fundamental challenges of cave exploration. The darkness is still total. The passages are still tight, still vertical, still flooded. The risk of rockfall, hypothermia, or disorientation remains. What has changed is our ability to document what we find, to map it systematically, to share that information, and to understand the cave as a complete system rather than a collection of isolated passages. Modern cave mapping is a meticulous process. A survey team, usually 2 to 4 people, moves through the cave measuring and recording. One person operates the instruments, a compass to measure bearing, an inclinometer to measure slope, and a tape measure or laser to measure distance. Another person records the data in a waterproof notebook or electronic device. Others in the team sketch the passage walls, noting their height and width, the location of formations, side passages, and other features. The measurements are taken in segments called survey shots from one station to the next. Each station is marked temporarily, perhaps with a piece of flagging tape or a small rock cairn, just enough to keep track of where measurements were taken. The data from all these shots is later compiled, usually using specialized software like Compass or Cervex, which processes the measurements and generates a map of the cave system, a line plot that shows the passages in 3 dimensions. The resulting maps can be remarkably detailed. They show not just the general route of the cave, but the shape of individual chambers, the location of pits and climbs, the course of underground streams. Cross-sections reveal the vertical profile of passages. Multiple surveys over time can track changes, the enlargement of a passage by flooding, the growth of formations, or the collapse of unstable sections. Some caves in the Blue Ridge have been surveyed multiple times as techniques improved or new passages were discovered. Early surveys from the mid-20th century, done with basic compass and tape, are sometimes compared with modern laser surveys, revealing discrepancies, but also showing how much the early surveyors got right with limited tools. LIDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, has revolutionized surface mapping and is beginning to be applied underground as well. A LiDAR scanner emits pulses of laser light and measures how long they take to bounce back, creating a point cloud, a three-dimensional model of the scanned space with extraordinary detail. On the surface, airborne LiDAR can penetrate forest canopy to reveal the ground beneath, identifying sinkholes, depressions, and cave entrances that might not be visible from the air or even on the ground. In caves, terrestrial LiDAR scanners can be set up in chambers to create detailed three-dimensional models of the space, capturing every texture and feature. These scans are useful for scientific study, for virtual tour that allow people to experience the cave without physically entering it, and for monitoring changes over time. Three-dimensional photogrammetry, another technique gaining popularity, uses overlapping photographs taken from multiple angles to construct 3D models. This method is less expensive than LiDAR and can be done with ordinary cameras, though it requires careful technique and significant computer processing. These technologies are particularly valuable in caves that are fragile or dangerous, allowing documentation without the impact of repeated human visitation. Cave diving represents the frontier of cave exploration in many systems. Where a passage fills with water, a sump, traditional caving techniques end and diving begins. Cave diving is among the most dangerous forms of exploration, combining the risks of diving, limited air supply, nitrogen narcosis, decompression sickness, with the challenges of cave navigation, zero visibility in silty water, tight restrictions, the possibility of getting lost with no way to surface. Specialized training and equipment are required. Cave divers use redundant systems, multiple lights, multiple air sources, and they lay guideline as they go, a physical tether back to open water. They plan their dives meticulously, calculating air consumption, decompression stops, and turnaround times with conservative margins for error. In the Blue Ridge, cave diving is less common than in some other karst regions, like Florida or Mexico, where extensive underwater cave systems are known. But some Blue Ridge caves do contain sumps, and a few dedicated cave divers have pushed these underwater passages, discovering air-filled chambers beyond, sometimes connecting cave systems that were previously thought to be separate. Dr. Bill Stone, a prominent cave explorer and engineer, developed the cislunar Mk1 rebreather specifically for deep cave diving expeditions. While his most famous explorations have been in Mexican cave systems, the technology and techniques he pioneered have influenced cave diving worldwide, including the occasional deep dives conducted in Appalachian caves. Conservation has become a central concern in modern speleology. The National Speleological Society, founded in 1941, promotes cave conservation through its motto, "Take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints, kill nothing but time." But even this has evolved. It is now understood that footprints themselves can cause damage, compacting sediment, destroying delicate formations underfoot, and altering the cave environment. Many caves on public land, including those in the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, which encompass parts of the Blue Ridge, are now managed with conservation as a priority. Some caves are gated, not locked but fitted with bat-friendly gates that allow airflow and bat passage while restricting human entry. Access to these caves requires a permit issued to experienced cavers who demonstrate knowledge of conservation practices and carry liability insurance. The gating of caves is sometimes controversial. Some argue that caves should be accessible to everyone, that restricting access is elitist. Others point out that unrestricted access has led to widespread damage, vandalism, and the destruction of formations that took millennia to form. The balance between public access and preservation is difficult, and different land managers have taken different approaches. In some cases, caves are closed entirely, usually to protect sensitive bat hibernation sites or rare formations. These closures are often seasonal, lifting when bats are not hibernating, or permanent when the cave is particularly fragile. Cave rescue is another aspect of modern speleology that has become highly organized. The National Cave Rescue Commission coordinates training and response for cave emergencies. Cave rescue is complex, requiring specialized knowledge of vertical rope techniques, confined space rescue, patient packaging, and transport in tight passages, and often multi-day operations to extract an injured caver from deep within a system. Several notable rescues have occurred in Appalachian caves over the decades, some successful, a few tragic. Each incident has contributed to improved training, better equipment, and a deeper understanding of the risks involved. Modern scientific expeditions in the Blue Ridge Caves are usually interdisciplinary, bringing together geologists, biologists, hydrologists, and archaeologists. One such project, conducted in the early 2000s, surveyed cave biodiversity across multiple systems in Virginia, documenting species distributions and collecting genetic samples to understand how isolated cave populations evolve over time. The project discovered several previously unknown species of cave-adapted invertebrates, tiny beetles and springtails that exist in only one or two caves, their populations numbering perhaps in the hundreds. Another project, focused on hydrology, used tracer dyes to map underground water flow. Researchers would pour a harmless fluorescent dye into a sinking stream or cave entrance, then monitor springs and wells in the surrounding area, sometimes for weeks, waiting to see where the dye emerged. The results revealed complex underground drainage patterns, with water sometimes traveling miles through the rock, crossing under ridges, and emerging in unexpected locations. This information is crucial for protecting groundwater, as contaminants introduced at the surface can travel rapidly through the Karst system, potentially affecting drinking water supplies far away. Climate science has also turned attention to caves. Speleothems, those stalactites and stalagmites growing over millennia, contain climate information locked in their layers. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in the calcite reflects the temperature and precipitation at the time each layer was deposited. By carefully removing and analyzing thin sections of a stalagmite, scientists can reconstruct climate conditions going back tens of thousands of years, creating a record that complements ice cores and tree rings. Dr. Kathleen Johnson, a paleoclimatologist at the University of California, Irvine, has studied speleothems from caves across North America, including some in the Appalachians. Her work has revealed patterns of drought and rainfall over the Holocene, showing that the climate of the Southeast has varied significantly over time, with periods of sustained drought that would have profoundly affected human populations. These scientific studies remind us that caves are not just static spaces to be explored and admired. They are archives, recording information about the Earth's past in ways that other environments cannot. They are laboratories where unique biological and geological processes can be studied. And they are increasingly canaries in the coal mine, sensitive indicators of environmental change, pollution, and ecosystem health. As we consider the state of modern cave exploration and science, we might ask, what drives people to continue exploring these dark, difficult, sometimes dangerous places? For some, it is the pure challenge, the physicality of the descent, the problem-solving required to navigate complex passages. For others, it is discovery, the possibility of being the first human to enter a particular chamber, to see formations that have waited in darkness for 1,000,000 years. And for still others, it is knowledge, the desire to understand how these systems work, how they connect, what they can teach us about geology, biology, and history. All of these motivations are valid, and often they overlap. The scientist who is also an adventurer, the explorer who contributes to conservation. What unites them is a respect for the underground world and a recognition that, even with all our technology and knowledge, we are still visitors in a realm that operates by rules much older than our presence. Despite centuries of exploration, despite modern technology and systematic surveys, there is much we still do not know about the caves beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains. The underground remains, in many ways, as mysterious as it has ever been, and the questions we can now ask are, if anything, more complex than those posed by earlier generations. How many caves exist in the Blue Ridge? We do not know. We know of hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 if we include every small cavity and rock shelter. But how many significant cave systems remain undiscovered, their entrances hidden by vegetation or rockfall, or simply never noticed in vast stretches of forest? There is no way to answer this with certainty. New caves are still being found, sometimes by accident, a hiker noticing a dark opening while bushwhacking off-trail, sometimes through systematic searching, cavers studying topographic maps and geological surveys to identify likely locations. Each new discovery suggests that others remain. Some of these undiscovered caves may be extensive. In karst regions elsewhere, major cave systems have been found in areas that were thought to be well explored, hidden by inconspicuous entrances or by sumps that previous explorers did not have the equipment to pass. There is no reason to believe the Blue Ridge is any different. What is the total length of passage in the Blue Ridge cave systems? Again, we do not know. The longest surveyed caves in the region measure in the miles, but many smaller caves have never been fully mapped. And the passages we know about may be only a fraction of what exists. Beyond sumps, beyond collapses, beyond tight restrictions that no one has yet squeezed through, there may be miles of passage still waiting. Cave hydrology remains poorly understood in many systems. We know water flows underground. We know that springs are fed by aquifers in the karst, but the exact pathways, the connections between sinking streams and emergence points, the size and shape of the aquifer itself, these are often educated guesses rather than confirmed facts. Tracer studies provide some answers, but they are expensive and time-consuming, and they only reveal the dominant flow paths, not the full complexity of the system. Modeling underground water flow requires detailed knowledge of rock structure, fracture patterns, and hydraulic conductivity, information that is difficult to obtain without extensive drilling or geophysical surveys. This lack of understanding has practical implications. Groundwater protection depends on knowing where water goes. If a landfill or industrial site is proposed in a karst area, knowing whether its leachate will enter the aquifer and where it will emerge is critical. Without accurate hydrological models, such decisions are made with incomplete information. The full extent of human occupation and use of Blue Ridge caves is another open question. Archaeological surveys have been conducted in some caves, but many have never been systematically examined. Sediments on cave floors may contain artifacts or organic remains that could answer questions about when people first entered these mountains, how they used the caves, what their lives were like. Excavation in caves is difficult and must be done carefully to avoid destroying the very evidence being sought. Stratigraphy, the layering of sediments, can be complex, disturbed by flooding or animal activity. Dating techniques, radiocarbon for organic material, optically stimulated luminescence for sediments, require expensive laboratory analysis. As a result, many caves that likely contain archaeological information have not been studied simply because of limited funding and personnel. What we do know suggests that there is much more to learn. Occasional finds, a stone tool uncovered by erosion, charcoal from an ancient fire, hint at deeper stories still buried. Cave formation processes, while understood in general terms, still hold mysteries. Why do some caves develop extensive decoration while others remain relatively bare? Why do certain passages continue to enlarge while others seem stable? What controls the three-dimensional geometry of a cave system, the branching patterns and loops, and vertical development? These questions have been studied by karst geologists for decades, but the answers are not simple. Cave development depends on rock structure, water chemistry, flow rates. The history of base level changes as rivers erode the landscape and time. Each cave is unique, the product of its particular combination of factors, and generalizations can only go so far. Climate history recorded in speleothems is rich with information we have barely begun to extract. Most speleothem studies focus on large, well-decorated formations that provide long records, but countless smaller formations exist, each potentially recording local conditions. Comparing records from multiple caves could reveal regional climate patterns, helping us understand how the Blue Ridge environment has changed over time and how it might change in the future. There are also biological questions. How many species live in Blue Ridge caves? Probably more than we currently know. Cave biodiversity surveys are incomplete, and new species are still being described. Some of these species are so rare and localized that they may exist in only a single cave system, making them vulnerable to any disturbance or change in conditions. Understanding the genetics and evolution of cave-adapted species can shed light on how long these populations have been isolated, how they adapt to extreme environments, and what makes them resilient or vulnerable. This knowledge is relevant not just for conservation of cave species, but for broader questions in evolutionary biology. One of the deepest uncertainties is simply this: what surprises remain? What will future explorers find that we cannot currently imagine? Every generation of cavers has discovered something unexpected. Chambers of unanticipated size, formations of types rarely seen, connections between systems thought to be separate. Evidence of human presence where none was expected. There is a humility in acknowledging how much remains unknown. We have mapped a fraction of the accessible caves. We have studied some of their features in detail. But the mountain keeps its secrets still, and for every question we answer, new questions emerge. Will we ever have complete knowledge of the Blue Ridge cave systems? Almost certainly not. Even if every passage were mapped, even if every formation were documented and every species catalogued, the caves would continue to change, to develop, to surprise us. They are not static museums, but living systems, evolving on timescales that dwarf human observation. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the value of the unknown is not just in the eventual discovery, but in the humility it teaches us, the reminder that the world is larger and older and more complex than we can fully grasp. The darkness beneath the mountains is not an absence to be filled with knowledge, but a presence in its own right, deserving of respect and wonder. As we near the end of our descent, as we prepare to return to the surface, we might carry this thought with us, that the greatest wisdom is often found not in certainty, but in recognizing the limits of what we know, and in approaching the unknown not with the need to conquer or claim, but with curiosity, care, and a willingness to be surprised. It is time to leave the cave. You have been underground for hours, or perhaps it only feels that way, time behaving strangely in the absence of sun and sky. Your light has guided you through passages narrow and wide, past formations that gleamed in the beam, over rocks worn smooth by ancient water. You have heard the drip of moisture on stone, the echo of your own footsteps, the silence that presses in when you stop moving and simply listen. Now you turn back, retracing your path, following the route toward the entrance. The passage that seemed to descend on the way in now climbs gently. The air, which grew cooler as you went deeper, begins to warm slightly, though the change is subtle, felt more than measured. And then far ahead you see it, a faint grey glow, the twilight zone where the cave begins to open to the world outside. As you approach the entrance, the darkness thins. Details become visible without your headlamp, the rough texture of the walls, the scatter of leaves blown in by wind, the pale green of moss clinging to damp rock where the last light reaches. You can hear sounds from outside now, sounds you had forgotten in the deep silence. The rustle of branches, the call of a bird, the soft movement of air through the forest. You step out into daylight, and for a moment it is almost too bright, even though the sun is low, filtered through trees. Your eyes, adjusted to the dark, squint and water. You stand at the cave mouth, at the threshold, and breathe the outside air, rich with the scent of earth and leaves and the faint sweetness of flowering plants somewhere upslope. The forest around you is quiet in the way of late afternoon. The day's heat is fading. Shadows stretch long across the ground. Above, through the canopy, the sky is beginning to take on color, the pale blue deepening toward the west, where the sun will soon touch the ridgeline. You sit on a boulder near the entrance, giving yourself time to adjust, to transition from the world below to the world above. The stone is warm from the day's sun, holding heat even as the air cools. You can still feel the cave behind you, its cool breath flowing out, the exhalation of the mountain. From this vantage, looking out across the valley, you can see the layers of ridges receding into the distance, each one slightly hazier than the last, the famous blue haze that gives these mountains their name. It is caused by organic compounds released by the trees, terpenes that scatter sunlight and create that soft, dreamlike quality to the far distances. Ridge after ridge, folding into the horizon, each one concealing its own valleys, its own hollows, and beneath many of them, unseen, the passages and chambers you have come to know. The sun continues its descent. The light changes from gold to amber to a deep, rich orange that makes the leaves glow. A breeze moves through the treetops, a gentle sound like distant water. Somewhere, a woodpecker drums on a dead tree, the rapid percussion echoing briefly before fading. You think about what you have learned, the stories the mountain holds. The deep time of geology, continents colliding and mountains rising and erosion, wearing them down grain by grain over hundreds of millions of years. The patient work of water dissolving stone, carving chambers and passages in the dark. The people who came before, who knew these mountains as home, who entered the caves for shelter and ceremony and survival, their presence now mostly vanished, but still traceable in fragments and traces. The settlers and hunters and refugees, each leaving their marks, their stories preserved in stone or lost to time. The folklore and legends, the human need to make sense of darkness and mystery. The strange beauty of formations growing in the deep silence. The delicate ecosystems adapted to life without light. The modern explorers and scientists continuing to map and study and discover. All of this, layered beneath the surface, hidden in the shadows, waiting in the quiet places. The sun touches the ridge and begins to sink below it. The sky in the west blazes briefly with color, pink and orange and purple, the clouds catching fire. The valleys fill with shadow, darkness rising like water, pooling in the low places first, and then climbing, slowly erasing the detail of the landscape. But the peaks still hold light, glowing for a few minutes after everything below has dimmed, islands of warmth in a sea of dusk. Birds are returning to their roosts, small shapes flitting through the branches, settling with soft calls and the rustle of feathers. A bat emerges from somewhere, perhaps from the cave behind you, and begins its flight, swooping and turning in pursuit of insects, a living connection between the underground and the sky. The first stars appear, faint at first, then clearer as the sky darkens. The evening star, Venus, bright in the west, and then others scattered across the dome of sky, the constellations beginning to form. The same stars that people have watched from these mountains for thousands of years, the same patterns, the same slow wheel of the heavens. Night settles gently. The temperature drops. Dew begins to form on the leaves, tiny droplets catching what little light remains. The forest is not silent, not really. It hums with life, the buzz of insects, the occasional call of an owl, the scurrying of small creatures through the underbrush. But it is a different sound than the day's, quieter, more contemplative, the mountain breathing softly as it always has. You could stay here all night, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the forest, feeling the cool air flow from the cave. But perhaps it is time to rest, to let the day's journey settle into memory, to allow sleep to come as naturally as darkness. And so you close your eyes, or perhaps you simply let them rest, unfocused, on the dim shapes around you. Your breathing slows to match the rhythm of the night. Your body, tired from the descent and the climb, relaxes into the stone beneath you, solid and ancient and patient. The mountain continues its slow work, indifferent to your presence. Water moves through the rock, dissolving and depositing, carving passages smaller than a grain of sand, enlarging chambers by imperceptible amounts. Formations grow, molecule by molecule. The cave breathes, the forest grows, the stars turn. And beneath it all, in the deepest chambers, in the passages no one has yet found, the darkness waits, complete and total and peaceful, a silence older than memory, a stillness that has always been and will continue long after we are gone. There is comfort in this, in knowing that the mountain does not need us, that it will endure regardless of our understanding or our presence. We are visitors, brief and small, moving through a story much larger than ourselves, and perhaps that is enough. To have seen a small part of it, to have descended into the darkness and returned. To carry the memory of stone and water and silence, a reminder that there are places in the world that remain wild and unknown, that resist our maps and our explanations, that simply exist, patient and quiet and complete. The night deepens. The air grows cooler. The dew thickens on the leaves. Somewhere far below, in the heart of the mountain, water drips into a pool, the sound echoing in a chamber no human ear has ever heard. A salamander, pale and eyeless, moves slowly across the gravel floor of an underground stream. A formation grows, adding another microscopic layer to the work of 10,000 years. And here, on the surface, under the stars, the forest settles into its nighttime rhythms. An owl calls, a long, descending note that fades into silence. The wind stirs briefly, then stills. The ridges, dark against the starlit sky, hold their ancient shapes, worn smooth by time, patient as stone, quiet as the mountains have always been. Sleep comes gently, like mist filling a valley, like darkness rising from the earth, like water finding its level. Your thoughts slow and drift, images of stone and shadow, echoes and formations, names carved in walls, rivers flowing in the dark. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurs, becomes unimportant. You are held by the mountain, by the night, by the long, slow story of the earth. And in that holding, in that quiet, there is peace. The Blue Ridge Mountains remain as they have for hundreds of millions of years. The caves continue their silent work. The water flows, the formations grow, the darkness waits. And you, listener, are invited to rest now, to let the story settle, to allow your breathing to slow and deepen, to feel the gentle pull of sleep like the pull of water through stone, inevitable and natural and right. There is nothing more you need to know tonight. Nothing more you need to do. The mountain will be here tomorrow and the next day and long after. The caves will keep their secrets and reveal them slowly in their own time to those who approach with patience and respect. For now, there is only this: the soft darkness behind your eyelids, the comfortable weight of your body at rest, the steady rhythm of your breath, and the knowledge that somewhere beneath the ancient mountains, in chambers filled with silence and stone, the earth continues its quiet work. Indifferent and eternal and strangely comforting. Sleep well.